I spent about 4 months 3 summers ago doing what I thought was the smartest belly fat plan of my life. I cut soda, I cut bread, I switched to almond milk in my coffee. I bought a freezer full of those individually wrapped protein bars with the embossed wrappers and the 14 grams of protein on the front. I ate cottage cheese the way other people eat oxygen. I walked 30 minutes every morning before work. I tracked everything in a notebook, which I now realize is a warning sign all by itself. I lost 4 pounds in the first 3 weeks, and then nothing happened for 2 months. And then my waistband actually got tighter. By August, the same jeans I'd started the summer in were cutting a red line across my stomach every time I sat down. I figured I'd hit some kind of genetic ceiling and went back to drinking the soda. 2 years later, almost by accident, I figured out the problem probably wasn't the calories. It wasn't even the foods I'd cut out. The problem was a small handful of specific ingredients that show up in almost every clean replacement product on an American grocery shelf. And they're doing something to your gut that has a very direct, very physical relationship with the fat that lives behind your abdominal wall. Not the fat you can pinch, the fat you can't. The kind that wraps around your liver while you're not paying attention. That summer, I was making one of the most common mistakes in modern American nutrition, and I had no idea I was making it. The grocery store was rewarding me for it. The food labels were practically congratulating me. The aisle I was shopping in had words like natural and skinny and plant-powered on every other carton, and the whole time my body was doing the exact opposite of what I wanted it to. They're called emulsifiers. The two with the loudest research files are polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose. The European numbering system tags them as E433 and E466, but most American shoppers will never see those codes. These aren't exotic chemicals. Polysorbate 80 is in most non-premium ice cream. Pull a tub of Breyer's Original out of any freezer aisle and read the back panel. Carboxymethylcellulose is in shredded cheese, in cottage cheese, in the cheaper almond milks, in the gluten-free bread that costs $9 a loaf at Whole Foods. Mono and diglycerides, same family, slightly different chemistry, are in nearly every commercial sandwich bread in America. Wonder Bread, Sara Lee, Pepperidge Farm, the bread on a Subway sandwich, the hamburger bun under your Big Mac. They're so common that the average American adult eats some form of food emulsifier with about half of the meals they sit down to, and most of the meals they don't. The reason these chemicals got into the food supply in the first place is texture. Back in the 1950s, food manufacturers figured out that adding a tiny amount of these compounds to a low-fat product made it feel in your mouth like a full-fat product. Suddenly, you could sell fat-free ice cream that didn't taste like wet chalk. You could sell almond milk that didn't separate in the back of the delivery truck. You could sell bread that stayed soft for 3 weeks on a shelf instead of going stale in 2 days. From the food company's perspective, that was a small miracle. From a regulator's perspective, in 1958, it was generally recognized as safe because nobody had heard of the gut microbiome yet, and nobody was really looking. That label, by the way, has never been revisited. The same designation handed out the year before Hawaii became a state still applies today to ingredients we now know behave very differently in the human body than anyone in the Eisenhower administration could have guessed. 68 years, no update, no fresh review. The shelf life of a generally recognized as safe label, it turns out, is roughly the shelf life of a loaf of Wonder Bread. In 2015, a research team led by Benoit Chassing and Andrew Gurwitz at Georgia State University published a paper in the journal Nature, and it almost completely flew under the public radar. They took ordinary lab mice and added a 1% concentration of either polysorbate 80 or carboxymethylcellulose to the animal's drinking water. That was it. They didn't change the food, they didn't restrict calories, they didn't add sugar or fat. They just spiked the water with a level of emulsifier that, in actual mass terms, was far below what the Food and Drug Administration considers safe for human consumption. 12 weeks in, the mice on emulsifiers had developed low-grade chronic inflammation in their gut lining, a measurable shift in their microbial population, fasting hyperglycemia, glucose intolerance, and, most importantly, significantly more visceral fat than the control mice eating identical food. Not subcutaneous fat, not weight in general, visceral. The fat tucked behind the abdominal wall, wrapping the liver and the pancreas, the fat that actually kills people. The males in the study also showed early signs of full-blown metabolic syndrome by the end of the trial. Visceral fat isn't inert storage, and that's the part most people don't understand. It's by a wide margin the most metabolically active fat tissue in the human body. It secretes hormones, it talks to the liver, it influences blood sugar and blood pressure and cardiovascular risk independently of almost every other variable doctors can measure. A man with a normal body mass index and a thick visceral layer has, on most metrics that matter, a higher mortality risk than a man with a high body mass index whose fat is mostly in his hips and thighs. There's an entire body of cardiology research built around what doctors call the thin outside, fat inside phenotype, and it's the population that surprises emergency rooms the most. So this isn't a vanity issue, it's a longevity issue dressed up as a waistline. The mechanism behind what the emulsifiers do is almost embarrassingly simple. Your large intestine is lined with a protective layer of mucus that's, in a healthy adult, about 150 microns thick, roughly twice the diameter of a human hair. That mucus is a physical barrier. It keeps the trillions of bacteria living in your gut on their side of the wall, and it keeps certain structural pieces of those bacteria, particularly a molecule called lipopolysaccharide, from leaking into your bloodstream. Emulsifiers do exactly what their name suggests. They emulsify. They thin the mucus. In the Chasang experiments, the protective mucus layer of the emulsifier-fed mice dropped from 150 microns down to under 50. The gut bacteria moved physically closer to the intestinal wall, and small amounts of lipopolysaccharide started showing up in places it was never supposed to be. Now stop thinking about mice for a second. This isn't a rodent problem. The reason this matters to you, specifically, is that the visceral fat depot, that layer of adipose tissue sitting behind your abdominal wall, wrapped around your liver and intestines, is patrolled by immune cells called macrophages. When even a small amount of bacterial lipopolysaccharide leaks out of a thinned gut barrier, those macrophages catch it first. They have to. Visceral fat receives a disproportionate share of the blood that drains directly from the intestines. That's the entire point of the portal circulation. The macrophages light up. They release inflammatory signals, tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6, directly into the fat depot they're sitting inside. That local inflammation makes the surrounding fat cells resistant to insulin. Insulin-resistant visceral fat cells stop releasing fat normally. They can only do one thing well, which is store more of it. The belt tightens, and the cycle reinforces itself because more visceral fat means more macrophages, which means more inflammation, which means more storage. That's called metabolic endotoxemia. The term was coined by Patrice Cani at the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium in 2007, and the body of work behind it has grown to the point that endotoxemia is now considered one of the leading explanations for why some people gain weight specifically in the abdomen while eating the same calories as someone who doesn't. Two people, identical diet, identical exercise. One develops a belly, one doesn't. The variable, increasingly, doesn't look like willpower. It looks like the integrity of the gut barrier and what's leaking through it. In 2022, Chaosang's group ran the emulsifier experiment in humans for the first time. They took healthy volunteers, put them on a controlled diet for 11 days, and gave one arm 15 grams of carboxymethylcellulose per day mixed into the food, roughly what you'd consume eating 3 or 4 heavily processed products in a single day. 11 days. Their gut bacteria had moved closer to the intestinal wall. Their microbial diversity had dropped measurably. Certain inflammation markers in their blood had climbed. A subset of participants showed the largest changes, suggesting that some people are far more susceptible to emulsifier damage than others, which might explain why the friend who eats exactly what you eat stays lean while you don't. The trial was too short to measure body composition changes, but the upstream machinery, the same machinery that had produced visceral fat gain in the mice, was clearly switching on in the humans. What makes this story specifically aggravating is that the Food and Drug Administration still classifies emulsifiers as generally recognized as safe. The European Food Safety Authority reviewed the human evidence in 2017 and recommended additional research. The research happened, the conclusions came back inconvenient. No regulatory change followed on either continent. A second French cohort study, published in 2024 and tracking over 100,000 adults, linked dietary emulsifier intake to higher rates of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, also generally ignored outside the field. Meanwhile, every low-fat, high-protein, plant-based, and gluten-free product introduced in the last 15 years uses these chemicals as a structural shortcut to mimic the texture of the thing they're replacing. Skinny ice cream has more emulsifier in it than regular ice cream. Plant milks have more emulsifier in them than cow's milk. The protein bar that markets itself on 14 grams of protein and 0 added sugar uses mono and diglycerides to hold its rectangle shape on a shelf for 9 months at room temperature. The healthier something claims to be in this aisle, the higher the chance the texture's being held together by something Chaosang has published a paper on. The labels aren't designed to make this easy on you either. A jar of natural peanut butter says peanuts and salt on the front and lists mono and diglycerides in the fine print on the back. A carton of vanilla almond milk lists carrageenan and gellan gum alongside the carboxymethylcellulose, both increasingly implicated in the same gut barrier research. Even some organic brands use these. The certifications for whether the cellulose came from a tree grown without pesticides, not for what happens when you swallow it. I think about that summer pretty often. The almond milk, the cottage cheese, the drawer full of protein bars I was eating because I'd convinced myself they were doing the opposite of what they were actually doing. I wasn't failing the diet. The diet was a different category of food than I thought it was. 3 years on, the same jeans fit again. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't go keto. I didn't fast for 16 hours a day. I didn't pay a coach $400 a month to scream macros at me through a phone screen. I just stopped eating things that listed 12 ingredients on the side panel and reserved the smallest font on the label for the one I couldn't pronounce.